Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment in our Bar Ilan lecture series that we are having here at Agudas Shalom. I know there's a little bit of confusion with the links, so hopefully people will continue to be coming in to join us for our lecture this evening. We are joined with Dr. Vanessa Workman, who is a lecturer and teaching specialist of archaeometallurgy. Did I get it right? I got it. At the University of Pennsylvania and the Penn Museum. She lived and studied in Israel since 2012, during which time she worked on numerous excavation projects and carried out research rooted in the material analysis of archaeological remains. Her work as a doctoral student at Bar Ilan University under Professor Aaron Mayer and Dr. Adi Elio Bahar focuses on the adoption of iron technologies and their historical, technological, and social impacts in the Levant and surrounding regions. Her research interests include the macro and micro investigation of various forms of craft production in the late second and early first millennia BCE in this area. So this is certainly not an area specialty we hear from every day, and we're very interested to see what direction you take us in. So without any further ado, I will spotlight you. And again, I ask everyone, remain muted. What's your preference? Do you prefer to take all questions at the end, or do you want to take questions throughout?
Questions throughout, that's fine with me.
Questions throughout, so I'll give people the ability to unmute themselves, use it judiciously. Okay, here we go. You have the floor.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. Just share my screen. So yeah, I realize I'm speaking about quite a niche subject this evening that I hope will interest some of you. So my work is mainly focused on looking at the material science aspect of archaeology. So taking materials and trying to understand where they come from, how they've been made, and a specialty during my PhD in pyrotechnology and in metallurgy. So I'll talk a little bit about today, much less about the actual metal artifacts, which I hope isn't disappointing to anyone, and much more about actually what we know about technologies from this 3,000-year-old period, how that relates to what we understand about the kingdoms that we know from the biblical texts, from the archaeology, and hopefully give you guys some idea of the type of research that I do. So I'll start my story at sort of a very exciting point in ancient history, which is the late Bronze Age, and I gave you the time period right at the bottom here. We're talking around about 1550 to 1200 BCE. And around this time is when these massive empires are existing. The Mycenaeans are controlling mainland Greece and all the islands around it. Hatti is controlling modern-day Anatolia and Turkey, and Egypt, as we know from the stories of Canaan, has taken most of modern-day Israel and is controlling the Nile in the region there. So this is where our story starts, and I start here because this is a moment in history where we know a lot about metals. We know that all of these cultures are using bronze, right? Bronze is copper and tin mixed together. All of their weapons and their daily artifacts, their jewelry, knives, things they're using in the kitchen are all made from this metal. And we have a ton of knowledge about how this metal is made and where it's coming from. And sort of the star of this story is Cyprus, this island in the middle, which has a big resource of copper that's being exported in really an international way all around the Eastern Mediterranean here. And goods are being traded for these copper ingots. They're called ox hide ingots. You can see it looks a bit like a stretched out ox skin here in the corner of the screen. And we have lots of other letters, the Amarna letters, which is people between Egypt and various kings throughout the Near East speaking to each other. We have shipwrecks, such as the Uluburun shipwreck, which I don't know if you can see my pointer, but right around the coast of southern Turkey sinks with a lot of these metal pieces in them. We know the Egyptians are moving into Canaan through the Sinai Desert and exploiting these resources. And we also have workshops all over Canaan. So we know what Canaanite, bronze, and copper working looks like. So this is a nice period in history where we have a really deep understanding of what's happening here. So On the left side of the screen, we see this network of Cyprus moving around. We have these huge mounds of slag, which is the byproduct of copper production in Cyprus that attest to this. Here's that shipwreck that was found in Uluburun. We have workshops like the workshop of Ramses II in Egypt, giving us chemical signatures that show that lots of different copper is moving around. And something happens in this period towards the late Bronze Age in which all of these empires collapse. Canaan, the Egyptians in Canaan shrink back into Egypt. The Mycenaeans fall. Hatti falls in Anatolia. And we see a real breakdown of the social network and the empire networks that are happening here. And there, at this point, and we start seeing cultures like the Israelites and the Phoenicians and the Edomites appearing in this region. And we see these cultures exploiting copper resources in this land at two main sites that I marked off here. One is in modern day Israel, just north of Eilat, which is the Gulf of Aqaba here, called Timna, and one a little bit further north near the Dead Sea called Feinan. And in this time period, in the early Iron Age, we suddenly see the exploitation of these copper mines perk up and are likely responsible for, or partly responsible, I should say, for the success of these kingdoms because copper was such a valuable resource at the time. So Timna and Feinan are doing this practice called smelting, and smelting is when ore, this rock, is heated up to a high enough temperature that we can extract copper out. And they're sending that copper that's extracted out, similarly to these copper ingots I mentioned a second ago from Cyprus, all over modern day Israel, which was ancient Israel then. And they're mixing it with bronze in workshops all over the country to make, mixing it with tin to make bronze there. So we know a lot about how this is functioning here. We have these huge sites, Timna and Feinan. You can see all the little mining crosses of the different mines and the over here and over here. We see these massive slag heaps, these heaps of slag attesting for copper production. And we even know from chemical signatures that copper is being sent all the way to places like Greece. And here's a bronze cauldron produced in Olympia that has the signature of either Timna and Feinan in its copper. So they're participating at a large scale now on this international trade. So like I said, around this time, we start seeing the rise of the Kingdom of Israel, the spread of this territory, the establishment of all kinds of different sites. These are archaeological sites that have been dated to this period. And we also see the arrival of the Philistines, right? So the Philistines are likely coming from places in the Aegean. They settle on the coast of modern day Israel in this region. We still have the cities of Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gat, and Gaza there. And we start seeing some different trends happening in this early Iron Age. I'm going to skip over these since we lost a little bit of time. So before I get to those trends, I'll just show you sort of this big diagram that we have a ton of understanding of copper in all of these periods. We know where the ore is coming from. We know how the material is being transported to cities. We know perhaps who is in control of these materials. We know what refining and alloying and working into objects look like. So we have a really nice, robust archaeological record to be able to speak about these materials. So what happens with iron? So we move from the late Bronze Age, all of these empires collapse, and we start now the Iron Age. Why? What's happening in this period? What is happening specifically with iron? So something really interesting happens, that the world doesn't see much iron prior to the Iron Age because the technology didn't exist to extract this iron from its ores. What we do see is a little bit of manipulating of materials called extraterrestrial iron. And extraterrestrial iron comes from meteorites that have fallen from space down to the earth and gives off a really pure form of iron metal. And you can see a few of these objects from very early period, this bead that didn't survive so well, not so beautiful, but this bead found from 3600 BCE in Cairo, this beautiful copper dagger from the tomb of King Tut, King Tutankhamun here. And all of these artifacts, very prestige level artifacts that were likely consumed by elite peoples in these days, are being made from this extraterrestrial iron. So the Iron Age hits and suddenly we see iron objects being consumed by people all over these small territorial kingdoms. And you see some of these artifacts that were very popular at the time, which is these knives found at several sites also throughout Cyprus and the Aegean, and some bracelets that are found as some of the earliest artifacts we have. And also at this time, we have this one letter, this one text that actually gives us some information that people are actually able to work iron. This is a Hittite text that comes from a textual record in Turkey that is some sort of Turkish or a Hittite at the time official speaking to an official in Egypt saying, we don't have any of the good iron in our storehouses right now. We can't send it to you. We're so sorry. We only have the bad iron, but don't worry, we'll send you this beautiful knife and we'll get you the good iron as soon as we can. Now, as archaeologists, we have no idea what this means. We don't know what the good iron is. We don't know what the bad iron is, but we do know around the time that the Hittites are writing about iron, we start seeing objects all over the place. Then we fast forward about 200 years later, and finally we start seeing in the archaeological record evidence of these people actually working iron. So we have a pretty large period of time where we don't know who's producing it. We don't know where this technology comes from, but we do have the artifacts. So a lot of studies have been done on those artifacts, but not a lot has been done on actual understanding of this movement between this copper technology and this iron. So why is this transition so such a big transition in technology? Well, there's a few things to understand. That the melting temperatures of copper and iron are very different. And people for a long time throughout history could reach this 1,830 degrees Celsius needed to melt copper, but they could not reach 1,535 degrees Celsius to melt iron. Because of that, a very different technology and a much more complicated version of this extraction process had to come about called bloomery smelting, which resulted in sort of this mixed mass of the actual iron material you wanted with a lot of that material that you didn't want anymore, that you were trying to get rid of, this slag material. So only in these periods, that 200 years after iron objects actually show up in the archaeological record, do we start seeing all of those types of materials. Theories based on these objects that are found of why this happens, why people suddenly start using this technology, what was the impetus to actually get up to that temperature? And a lot of those have related to this collapse of these empires, that perhaps it was a lack of resources. One reason for the collapse of empires was possibly major climatic fluctuations that changed perhaps what trees were growing in the area, needed for fuel for these. And at this moment also, Cyprus stops producing copper in a major way. So perhaps this loss of this international trade of copper was resulted in sort of the stopping and starting now of producing iron. Now we have some contrary evidence, right? I mentioned already that Timna and Fainan become very active in this period, that they are actually mining copper, but we still don't know much about tin. So there's still some questions in that, but perhaps lack of resources is not the actual issue in this period. I mentioned also that the Philistines arrived from the Aegean, perhaps as a technology that is brought outside that we have yet to see some sort of technological evidence for, either in Cyprus or in Greece. There's also a question that maybe some accidental iron production happened from these new copper sources, which actually have a lot of iron in them. A lot of the question also, or the discussion around these objects that were found, is that iron must have been superior over bronze in that it makes a much sharper and better maintained knife than bronze. But we have a lot of questions in how much carbon was actually in these knives, so how much steel they're producing, and questionable whether these knives would have actually been better than the prior strength of bronze that was already had been produced for quite some time. Lots of studies are counting the number of iron objects that happen in different periods. And you can see in this little chart that at some point around this moment, this red line representing when workshops start appearing, we see a shoot up of iron, the number of iron objects that appear in the archaeological record. And in the past 10 years or so, we've also found that this correlates to now workshops producing iron within the Kingdom of Israel and Philistia, also rising. So you see lots of these dots on this map of places that we now know only within the past, let's say 15 to 20 years, are actually producing iron. So we can start piecing together, why is this technology coming? Where is it coming from? And how is it taking shape in these kingdoms? have, after being able to understand very deeply about the archaeological record of copper, is where are all these activities happening? Where are the mines for iron? Where are they doing this smelting activity? Do people in these small workshops inside of cities we now know about actually know how to do this full process, or were they just the ironsmiths at the time, right? This is a very familiar image to us from Renaissance fairs or from this period of the blacksmith hammering iron. So do we have evidence of this full sequence of process, or are we just seeing people already working, perhaps resharpening blades or working an iron knife into a different object? These are questions that we can now only answer after several studies have been done. And I'll skip over this since we're running a little bit behind time. So here are the sites that we found these workshops in. And so I call this lecture, these big transitions in small spaces, because we're talking about large urban sites. We're talking about pretty small workshops inside those urban sites. So we're actually seeing sort of the tangibility of this shift from one metal to another happening in very small spaces, which is contrary to these massive copper smelting sites that we see in the time. These workshops often look like this. You can see some fire activities that's happening, right? Heating, some sort of installations that look a bit like ovens, or maybe some stone-lined hearths that are withholding fires in order to work iron. We also see the appearance of what looks a bit like rusty rocks, I'm sure in this picture, but this is actually the slag that's produced, this waste product during the production of iron. We also have these tuyères, as they're referred to in our field, which is just the French word for nozzle. And this is what would have gone into the fire, and oxygen would have been either pumped through by breath or some sort of bellows device in order to heat the temperature higher. So we start finding these in workshops, which is really pointing towards metallurgical activity happening. So this is one site we looked especially at, is the site of Megiddo, which is a traditional Israelite site. The people that lived there before were indigenous Canaanites. They lived there for and occupied the site for a long period of time. And we're comparing what's happening there to the site of Tel Asafi, or biblical Gat. Perhaps you know it as the homeland of Goliath in the stories, in the biblical narrative. So Gat is a huge site. And in Gat, we've found iron workshops from this same period in two places: Area D, which is in this image here, our very large lower city area, and Area A, which is on top of the Acropolis of the site. So ironworking happening both in sort of industrial workshop area where other products are being made near a gate, so likely related to industry, and one happening more near public buildings related to administration. Prior one little slag here, you see this rusty little rock was found in Area A, and it started this question of how Philistine ironworking relates to Israelite ironworking. And when that was investigated, the researchers found that it seemed like the Philistines were doing the full process, right? So in this diagram, you see that they're taking ore, they're putting it into a furnace, they're getting this mass of iron and slag together called a bloom, and they're working that bloom all the way to an object. We then, several years later, in Area D, in our lower city, first found a pretty large temple or shrine that came with a beautiful two-horned altar and all kinds of small ceramics that suggest that some sort of cultic activity was happening. A bit to the east, we found areas where they were weaving. You can see in the picture down here, all these little balls, which are actually weights for looms. And we found this beautiful matzabah, or a carved standing stone, that some sort of cultic activity is also happening in relation to industry that's happening over there. And just next to these installations in this sort of long hallway here, we found lots of heated installations holding all kinds of materials, suggesting that iron and copper are being worked together in the same space. So different types of stones, crucibles that held the mixing of copper and tin to make bronze, and all types of these tuyères, or these nozzles, that would have helped in heating the fire. Lots and lots of these rusty rocks called slag, so much that we could actually make a whole typology out of this slag. And we realized that something different is happening at this Philistine site of Gat than what's happening at all of these Israelite sites, from which now we have quite a bit of material. And from that research, we started asking our questions. We know we have the iron objects, right? Those have come already 200 years prior. We know something about these installations in these nozzles or tuyères. We have all this waste products happening from both smelting and smithing, but we're still missing quite a bit of information. We have no idea where the ore source is. We don't know actually what they're trading during this period, what the equivalent of the ingot would be that's moving around from site to site. And we don't really know the commercial value of iron because of that, because we can't flush out this full sequence. Our study starts coming in that we know iron objects are there. We know several hundred years later, we have the introduction of ironworking. We're not quite sure where these different activities are happening or how they might relate to the raw resources. And we also want to understand why things look somewhat different at Gat, at this Philistine site, than at these traditional Canaanite sites or Israelite sites that were already working copper and bronze for quite some time. So our aims were to understand this production chain, to understand different signifiers of the raw materials and working techniques from different types of chemical analysis, and also to explore this idea of technological adoption and adaptation. So if this technology came from an outside source and was introduced, how can we sort of see signifiers of how these people adopted these technologies based on the current metallurgy that they were already practicing? So we had a really exciting project headed by one of my advisors, Dr. Eliyahu Behar, and it was a sort of a four-prong in that my position in this project was to analyze this new archaeological material that's coming out, to understand what we can sort of collect from different chemical signatures and microstructure signatures. We also did a big survey of ore sources in the southern Levant, mostly in modern Israel. We investigated some new chemical techniques for provenancing iron, for understanding where the sources of iron are using osmium isotopes. And we did lots of experiments, which you see pictures of here, of trying to smelt iron in various different types of installations and trying to understand the technology behind those converting those ores into metal. So you see all of us standing here measuring different temperatures in our big smelting furnace. Here is us roasting some ores in a bonfire. And here is our master smelter, Lee Sauter, working a bar of iron that we produced into an object on his smithing anvil. Cut open these rusty rocks, this byproduct of smelting, subjected to several different types of analyses, and try to come to an understanding of perhaps where this material is. Oh, Moshe, please.
You can finish your thought first. It's okay. It's not a.
Oh. I'm about to start a new thought, so please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just wondering. You're talking about different cultic activities that were done back in the ancient Near East. So I'm curious. You'll look through Tanakh, you'll look through the Bible, and you'll see sometimes it talks about molten gods. Other times it groups wood and stone together without reference to metal per se. And I'm curious if you have any theories as to, was there like there's like the higher class kind of gods that they could afford to get the metals, and the wood and stone were maybe the more pervasive ones. Just historically, what's your sense of that?
I mean, not related to my work, but there have been some theories put out that Yahweh might have been a smelting god, right? The head of the Canaanite and Israelite pantheon of gods was perhaps a god related somehow to metallurgy, because a lot of the imagery that you're speaking about sounds like smelting in some way. So we don't know, none of it is really direct evidence, but the possibility that at least this imagery of smelting, this fire coming out, this mystical idea of converting a rock into a metal was actually pretty impactful for ancient peoples, right? As it is for us today to actually see that happen in front of our eyes. So there was we find quite a bit. I won't have time in this lecture, but I can just go back quite often when we find metallurgy, we find it next to some sort of temple or shrine or some sort of installation like this matzabah here, the standing stone, that points to this connection between either needing a god's blessing in order to actually be successful in smelting, or in any sort of we're talking high temperature activities, they were dangerous. This also we have evidence like this from mines. Timna and Fenan both have temples from the Egyptian periods and the Israelite periods of control. So definitely a strong connection between these two concepts.
Would Molech be one of those gods that was about smelting, and that's why it's all about fire?
Moloch possibly is, yeah, I don't know if that's a question I can really answer with any authority. There's been a lot of speculation. I have no archaeological evidence to, yeah, it's interesting. Safi specifically, or Gat, has two temples, and next to both of those temples, we found smelting. So, and one of them seems to be associated perhaps with a female deity, and the other one with a male deity. So it's interesting that smelting is happening at both, that perhaps this conversion of rock into metal is a significant sort of act that would have been associated with, right? We also find these painted ceramics with the little petals here that sort of look like goblets, were tested for residues and found to be incense burning. So all of these, fire and smoke and things that probably connected to metallurgy.
Thank you.
Quick question though. I mean, Rabbi Kritz, maybe you'll be the one that needs to answer this, but wasn't iron forbidden to be used in the temple?
So
or in the altars? I mean, copper, yes. Copper, you had the copper, basins and all these different things. But wasn't iron specifically like you shall not have iron on your altars, or?
Well, metal, right, specifically for the altar, because the altar was meant to extend life. So you're not supposed to use metal that is makatzer, that shortens life. It doesn't mean that there's no presence of metal in the temple altogether. You have items that are made of that, but for the altar specifically, it shouldn't be fashioned with it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, how does it? Why is it that metal shortens life?
A sword.
Oh,
yeah, both for animal butchery and weaponry.
Yeah.
So what's used for shechita on the altar? Don't they use knives?
I think it's for the fashioning of the altar, not necessarily for the use of the sword.
work on.
Mm-hmm.
And in earlier times, they would have had to use stone, I guess, for killing and stuff, I guess.
Yeah, flint blades for sure. We have in earlier periods, but we're into really early periods, about 4,000, 5,000 years ago.
Okay, well, that's before us.
Yeah. Okay, so I'll just skip past this a bit. It's lots of complicated micrographs, but just to give you the sense of the type of work that we're doing, that we're cutting open this waste product, embedding it in resin, shaving it down to a really nice shiny surface, putting it under a microscope, and trying to understand something from these, right? So you see that the ones on the left are these full pieces of these iron slags that are being produced, and we're asking ourselves, what technology does this represent, right? I don't always have the object that was produced from this technology sitting in front of me, left in that workshop, right? That's probably been traded out or sold somewhere in the town or the village, but I do have this waste product. And what we can understand from most of the sites that we find this record from is that they weren't actually converting rock into iron, but they were only working as blacksmiths, right? They were taking iron that was given to them at the site, and they were transforming that into the object. And I can tell that from things like this sort of little dash of white here is actually a hammer scale. So if I hit an iron object that's been heated, some of that iron is going to oxidize and flake off and fall into my hearth. So we find a ton of these at these sites. So that points to us that they're actually blacksmithing here. So you can see them as little lines sort of inside of these slags, and as larger chunks that are dissolving into this material. But something that's really interesting is that we again see this repetition of something is different happening at Megiddo and all of those Israelite sites than what's happening at Gat. And if you can see just in terms of color and shapes that are happening in this Megiddo microstructure, my slags from Israelite sites are only composed of iron. There's nothing in them. So it looks like they're working objects that already are objects. They're smithing them into something else or maintaining a blade, and they're putting it back into the economy. But at Safi, I have all of this silica material. So silica is things we find in sediments and sands and things right naturally in our environment. Ceramic can be made from lots of silica. So this seems to be melting and going into their furnace. And we find that in all of their waste product, there's pretty high percentages of silica.
Wouldn't Isn't it possible that the reason there's a difference between an area that was ruled by Philistines and in Israelite territory is the Philistines weren't observing a Shabbat, so they could keep their heating sources going 24/7, which is a whole different thing than if you've got to turn it off for a day and then get started up for a day. So maybe that's why the Israelites didn't have the smelting going on.
That's possible. We also have reference in Samuel to this idea that the Israelites don't have access to maintaining their own weaponry, that they have to go down to Philistine cities, which is a strange reference because now we see in the archaeological record, we have lots of evidence for Israelites being able to maintain their own weapons. But strangely, we have this like sort of, very clear reference in I believe 2 Samuel that they would have had to have gone to the Philistines. So it seems that the Philistines are doing something different, right? So in this slag, we're seeing something different. So without a reveal of what happens next in this lecture, I'll keep going and say at least our expectation is happening. So to try to better understand these microstructures, we did lots of experiments, and you can see all of our little hearths that we've built and trying to recreate sort of what we're finding in the archaeological record. And you can see sort of amusingly that we didn't have the skill to keep these fires going with different bellows systems. So we use hair dryers, which turns out to be a metallurgist's best friend. It produces the perfect amount of heat and oxygen into your installation to keep going. And to keep that temperature up. And we tried all different ores, mostly from the Negev desert, which would have been locally available ore sources, right? To try to recreate these things. And we learned lots of different things about the microstructures, how iron acts in these certain environments, so that we can better interpret what we found in the archaeological record. We also looked at our waste products that came from smithing. You find, if you recognize the shape just from clicking through here, that we're finding a lot of these smithing hearths, which look like they solidified at the bottom of a sort of a little bowl hearth. And we found that this was actually pretty close to what we find in the archaeological record, sort of these globs of iron that fall in while smithing. And you see these nice large chunks of charcoal from our hearth that gets trapped, and a lot of the same shapes in the minerals that we find in the microstructures. We also do all kinds of chemical testing to try to understand, okay, we're seeing a visual difference, but do we actually see something different in the chemical aspect of these slags? And we do. This line here on this graph shows that all of the Megiddo slags have much higher iron, and all of the Safi slags or the Gat slags have much lower iron and higher silica. And this is replicated in data that was taken prior to me coming onto the project. So these are all our Israelite sites, and this is from that other area of Safi. So the data is being replicated over and over again. These are a lot of complicated graphs just to once again show if I put all of my elements present in the analysis that we got, that the same thing matches here. So these are my elements that are most common in my slags, and I see that Megiddo all clusters together and Safi or Gat all clusters together. And the same thing with this older legacy data, that all of the Israelites cluster together and the old Gat data also. Trace elements, these are elements that appear in very minute amounts, are really interesting because they teach us something about our ore sources. There are certain elements that travel from the rock into the iron. It can give us a clue to where these materials actually came from. So interestingly, also when we look at our trace elements, we do find a difference between what's happening in Megiddo and what's happening at Safi. And two of those particular elements that are really interesting are nickel and manganese. And that's exactly what separates these two. Those two elements happen to travel with iron, especially. They love iron, they stay with the metal. So as signatures that perhaps is also different ore sources that are being exploited between these kingdoms. We also tried to ask the question of what the relationship between iron and bronze are. So in both cities that we're looking at, we were finding evidence for bronze working and for iron working in the same workshops. And if we look at the content in all of these iron slags, I see that in Megiddo, in this Israelite city, that there's a lot of copper falling into my iron slags. So this is all of the samples, and this is the amount in parts per million. So it's pretty small amounts, but still a lot of copper being lost into these slags. And we believe that they're actually working both of these metals in the same hearth, which is really interesting, which means that the smiths who already were working copper And bronze in these workshops probably adopted this technology, right? They weren't new people that came in to produce these metals. They were the same people that had existed in these cities that continued to produce. And I see the same thing, maybe not in all sites in the Israelite kingdom, but that Hatzor, which is also a major city in the north of the Israelite kingdom, shows me the same thing, that there's quite an intimate relationship between copper working and bronze, both spatially and chemically. What our thoughts of with these differences, why these things are happening. Then in Megiddo, we see this high integration of bronze and iron in one working space in the same hearth with the same craftspeople. From our analysis, we see that most sites, especially Hatzor, the city of Rehov, Beersheba, and Bet Shemesh, all have a similar chemical and material structure to them. So which would point to us that the same activity is happening there. And that activity, based on this high iron content and all of these little smithing hammer scales that are falling off onto the ground, suggests that they're just smithing objects there. So what's really happening in Gat? What is so different between these two sites? And our interpretation is that perhaps the semi-product, so after a smelt happens, we now have this bloom, and this bloom is a mixture of iron and slag, right? So slag would also have a lot of silica in it. It's all the parts of the rock you don't want, but get trapped inside. That perhaps Gat is an entry point of this ironworking into at least the kingdom of the Philistines, and they're actually working at a very high level to refine this material before it's actually being sent out. So perhaps this is our middleman here that's sort of working like this trade of ingots we see with copper, that something is coming into Gat. Gat is also a massive site during this period, and there seems to be some connection also between metal trade coming into the Philistine kingdom and going out into the international Eastern Mediterranean trade. So perhaps Gat is also in connection somewhere working this iron, and that our certain number of our trace elements, and also this high temperature of actually melting the silica with this iron is suggesting that earlier parts of this process is happening. Sort of just sums up the same I just said, but I'll just add that our next stage in this process is to try to refine this and with some more chemical analysis, because we want to understand exactly where this ore source is coming from, because we see throughout history whoever controls the ore source controls things like weaponry and agriculture and all the types of tools that are associated, right, with both daily life, empires, and successful, military activity. So it's actually quite consequential, right, to have to control these ore sources. So while we know that there seems to be something different and different ways of adoption of this technology, that doesn't seem like a technology that maybe was invented in either of these kingdoms, that we do see some sort of difference between the way these materials are actually being worked and perhaps between the sources that are being exploited. Iron is also known in early periods from mostly Roman sources as being this idea of a democratic metal, because it is so much more common on our earth than copper is. So it's questionable whether actually in these periods was, could any ore source, could any iron source be exploited, or would one have to know exactly the type of iron? It had to be rich enough, what the rock really looked like, and that rock source only perhaps appeared in certain places. So these would actually be really, different constructions on how these small territorial kingdoms that show up during the Iron Age and really flourished during the Iron Age were actually, surviving and working. So that's just a little shot into the type of research that we're doing, constantly digging at sites like Tel Safi and Megiddo to find new information. We just wrapped up, actually this week, published the results of our experimental activity, and sort of the next phase to keep going is to keep completing this production change to understand more and more about these complex technological processes.
Okay, that's a conclusion, right? Okay, Dr. Workman, thank you so much for your time. Do you have a few minutes for any remaining questions?
Sure.
Okay, wonderful. This is a very fascinating presentation. There's a real good connection here between our heritage with the land of Israel, our knowledge of Torah, and just really understanding the Israelite people and also the surrounding cultures that give us a better understanding of our Jewish heritage. So thank you so much for your expertise on this very interesting subject matter. Does anyone else have any questions that weren't addressed yet that they would like to ask? before we
I
wrap
have a
up?
question.
I just
You have a bit of an echo, I think.
I just wanted to ask, well, first of all, thank you very much for this presentation. It's absolutely fascinating. How did you start to get interested in this and get involved in this? I'd love to hear a little bit about your background, how you kind of,
Sure. Well, I was finishing my degree in music education, actually in Connecticut at the University of Hartford. And I met a man named Dr. Richard Freund, who was the head of the Jewish Studies department at Hartford for a very long time. I think he left only a couple of years ago. And I told him I was really interested in the philosophy of religion. And he said, great, come to Israel and work on an excavation with me. And I absolutely fell in love with it. So I started going back and forth sort of as a graduate assistant and excavating quite a bit there. And when I moved to Israel to work on my master's degree, I had the opportunity to excavate these massive copper production sites in Timna. And slag is not the most exciting material that most people would, throw away if looking at an excavation. But it really fascinated me, like how much information you can pull out of these really complicated processes from this. And how consequential these trade networks and these interactions were. So metallurgy really grabbed me from that. And I then through Professor Aaron Meir, got this opportunity to work on his material for my PhD.
thank you. Interesting.
Thank you. Was
I
there
have a
someone else?
question about the archaeological finds in terms of how many people might have been actually involved in the work itself. In other words, is there any way to determine if there's just a very small number of people in these societies that had this information, or obviously there's no real way to be sure of it, but any way to read that into the materials that you've got?
Right. Yeah. So I can talk, like, if I separate the amount of waste product we find between a site like these copper production sites and what's happening in these small workshops inside, and I can really talk about on the difference between an industrial scale. We find, I think, something like 40,000 tons of slag at a copper production site. So we're talking, people coming in seasons, massive mining, massive exploitation, versus what we find in workshops, which is actually a very limited amount, 50 kilos of this waste product. So it's extremely challenging to understand how long of a time period that actually represents, because we also know from ethnographic research that it was very common that someone would come in, clean out the workshop, and also because these technologies were still a bit clumsy, they were constantly reprocessing waste products to try to extract as much metal. So that complicates our issue, right? Then they have the issue of recycling of metal also, right? That these things for years and years could be reused and reworked. So it's very hard to know. We do guess, though, in an urban society, that it was very likely that crafts such as metallurgy, being that it had this mystical aspect to it, also seeing the locations of these workshops, which are often in prestige areas of cities, probably had sort of like a guild-like structure to them, where that knowledge was protected, and probably very few people actually had access to that. You can imagine if too many people know how to make a sword, it won't do you very well as the rulers of your city, right? But it's really difficult to actually judge, to give, an actual number to that. I'm guessing a small amount. And also we find a small amount of remains in most of these, but it's so hard to know if they were cleaned out, or that represents really the protection of this knowledge.
It's really interesting. Thanks. That's more than I expected.
Great. Anyone else have a question? All right, thank you. This was extremely informative, a very fascinating topic that we don't get to hear about every day. So thank you again for your time and for partnering with us here at Aguda Shalom. We're looking forward to the next lecture in the series.
My pleasure.
Calendars, and God willing, we'll get
Thank
the
you so
right
much.
one. All right, have a good evening, everyone.
Have a great evening.
Thank you very
guys.
much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.